experiencing or things that we might consider managing for in the future. Obviously, the one thing we're very familiar with down here is the impact of hurricanes, but we're going to touch on a whole bunch of different things throughout the talk. There we go. All right, so we're going to look at different things related to impacts of the urban landscape and how that can affect tree survivability and establishment, and then we'll kind of tie that into the natural disasters component here. We're going to look at climate change in general, as far as the different disasters that kind of play into that. Like I said, the hurricanes piece is what we experience here, and then relate that to trees. And then we're going to look at different ways we can manage this adversity in regard to improving tree establishment, survivability, and maximizing those long-term benefits, minimizing some of the risks associated with trees. And then at the very end, depending on how long I go on for, I tend to be a little bit wordy, we'll look at some of the projects that my lab's currently involved in that touch on climate change in relation to trees. All right, so I assume, most people on this call understand the benefits that trees provide, environmental, economic, social. There is the potential for issues related to public health and safety, damage to property, things like that. But big thing to keep in mind here, all the research that's been done on trees and risk, the risk of injury or death is going to be extremely low as a result of a tree failure. In the US, there's about 36 fatalities a year on average. And then in the UK, there's about 6, and we're a considerably larger country than UK, so it's pretty proportionate there. But either way, very low likelihood that you're going to be killed by a tree failure. It does happen, but you're more likely to die from, a lightning strike, or if you're a cigarette smoker or bad diet or whatever, than you are a tree failure. All right, so here, we see 2 different scenarios. One thing to keep in mind here, assuming, you have some sort of conducive site conditions, trees have the potential to be long-lived organisms. So, proper planning, design, management, this is all necessary in order to, maintain the health of the tree and promote a more sustainable urban forest. One issue we have is a lack of consistency across municipal codes and policies. So, that's something else to consider as far as how we're managing these trees. But this here is 2 images of different neighborhoods in Detroit, and you can see the disparity in tree cover between the 2 parts of town. So we obviously want more situations like the one on the right, but you can tell here that these different areas have been managed for different reasons over the years, and that's kind of how they've ended up the way they are. The other thing we need to consider here is new development. So we have situations where already densely populated areas are going to have population booms. We're seeing that in Florida. Along with this, a lot of compact development is maximizing the square footage of the structure. And a result of this is smaller lot sizes, smaller areas to plant trees. The city of Gainesville recently passed a code that basically said the minimum planting distance in front, on the side of your house, wherever, as far as space that you have to plant a shade tree, is now 10 foot. That works for smaller species, but then when you have underground and overhead utilities, obviously the structure there, sidewalks, curbing, all that stuff, a 10-foot space isn't really conducive to a shade tree. So we're going to lose some of those benefits, as a result of this. Or if you do plant shade trees, you're going to have more conflicts with infrastructure. So we want to avoid that. Obviously, increasing the space is going to be better for that long-term success. When you have these smaller spaces surrounded by infrastructure, trees can get stressed out. You have issues with early mortality, premature removals. Another thing I'm seeing as far as new developments, a lot of HOAs are putting the onus of planting trees on the person that purchases the property. I saw this firsthand at an HOA that my parents bought into in Alabama. And essentially, you'd be amazed at how few people actually care to plant a tree. So this development had been there for 5 years, and maybe, if I was to guess, less than 5% of the houses in a 1,000 house development actually had trees planted in front of their house. So if it's not enforced or, done prior to the property exchanging hands, there might be less trees actually going into the ground. And we're going to end up with situations like you see here on the screen where got a lot of houses, small yards, big structures, and not a lot of room for trees to be planted. All right, so I'm sure some of you might have seen these maps here. This is from the 2070 Florida project. And essentially, it looks at differences in sprawl, among other things, from 2010 to 2070. And essentially, by 2070, about a third of the state is going to be developed, and the population will have almost doubled since 2010. So they're projecting somewhere around 34 million people by 2070. And what you notice here is that areas that are already densely populated are going to become more densely populated. So your coastal areas, which is why a lot of people move to the state and want to be by water. But then also in the center of the state, reason being, you have more available land, and land is going to be cheaper there. Get larger lot sizes to put up those big houses. And so you're going to see a lot of people move there as well. But the big takeaway from here is that, we need to be more strategic with our planning, especially when we have these compact developments. We got to make sure that we leave room for trees and then also their future growth. The other thing that plays into this is that climate change piece. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is expecting by the end of the century that we're going to see this 2.7 to 3.6 degree Fahrenheit increase in global surface temperatures. Over the summer, I'd heard that we've already surpassed that minimum threshold. So those temperatures are going to be likely higher than what they were anticipating when this report came out. And if I remember correctly, the report came out in the last year and a half or so. But with this, we're going to see this increased frequency and intensity of, droughts, fires, extreme wind events, whether it be hurricanes, tornadoes, pest and disease outbreaks. These are all things we've been seeing in the news. So, just something to keep in mind that we are starting to see more of these things and more damaging effects as a result. And ultimately, all of these events can pose potential risks to our urban forests and the potential benefits that we receive from them. And then just to put it in context of the Southeast, we're going to experience warmer minimum temperatures and less precipitation as time goes on. All right, so some of you may have seen this. This is an interactive map that predicts future hardiness zones. It's done by the Arbor Day Foundation and Davey tree experts. So if you orient yourself to the top left there, that's showing from 1980 to 2009. And then you work your way over to the right, that's 2010 to 2039. Down bottom left, 2040 to 2069, and then bottom right is 2070 to 2099. What you see here is some of those higher hardiness zones that we typically see in South Florida are starting to make their way up throughout the state. So, just one thing to consider here is that a lot of the species that we currently plant in the different areas throughout the state might not be viable moving forward. And certain species that are planted, in the southern parts of the state might now be viable as far as, potential street trees or ornamentals, 100 years down the road, stuff like that. So, the big thing here is we need to have this kind of forward thinking as far as our urban forest management, what species we're planting and how, the species that we're currently planting may be impacted in the future. And maybe we can get ahead of some of the impacts of the warming that we're going to experience. And then just to zoom in on West Palm Beach, because I think some of you guys are from that area. This is kind of what you're going to be expecting to see down in your neck of the woods. Essentially, there might not be much difference as far as changes in hardiness zones, for certain coastal areas, including West Palm Beach. But then, some of the center parts of the state are going to experience, some of those more drastic changes. But whether you look at best case or worst case scenario, it doesn't really look like it's changing much over that 100+ year period down in that part of the state. Overall, when we look at global surface temperatures, since they started recording these, when you look at about the late 1970s, there's this upward trend of global surface temperatures increasing over time. A lot of this could be contributed to, automobile usage. So, if you look at just the last 5 years or so, we're having some of the hottest years on record. I just heard recently that 2024 is going to be the hottest year on record. So, unless this trend changes, some of those issues related to climate change could potentially be expedited. Like I mentioned, we passed those thresholds earlier from what they were talking, from that report a year and a half ago. So, we'll see where we end up, but it's definitely something we need to start being a little bit more proactive about because it seems like we're dropping the ball here. There's another interactive map out there. So you can basically put in whatever your city is. This was done by the University of Maryland, and they will tell you what your future conditions are potentially going to be like. So I put West Palm Beach in, and they're expecting by 2080 that West Palm Beach is going to have a climate similar to a city in Saudi Arabia, Abu Arish Jazan. Not familiar with it myself, but if you are, it's going to be similar to that. And essentially what they're saying is that for high emissions, summers in West Palm Beach, Florida are expected to be about 7.6 degrees warmer and 15.8% drier. And then in the winters, you're going to expect about a 6.4 degree increase in temperatures and about 13.6% wetter. So it's going to change the climate in the next 60 years based off of the way we're trending right now with some of our emissions. So when you look at some of the ramifications of disasters we've had since they started tracking these, if you look at the 1980s, there was approximately 33 different billion-dollar weather events costing about $218 billion, and these have all been adjusted for current prices. So along with that, they had about 3,000 deaths. One thing I'll just mention, I'm not going to mention the deaths every time. They stay pretty consistent across the board most decades. But what you'll notice here is that as time goes on, the number of events and the cost of the events increase. So we're starting to see that frequency and intensity, as mentioned in that report. So the 90s, there was about 60 events, about 330 billion. The 2000s, 67 events, about 620 billion. And then when you get to the 2010s, it almost doubles in the number of billion-dollar events. So 131 events, almost $1 trillion. And then 2023, we had 28 events alone, almost $100 billion. And then when you look at the entire span of that 44-year period, there was about 400 events and about $2.8 trillion, just to kind of put it in context. So you're seeing just individual years, the numbers of events and the cost of these events are also increasing. And then when we look at 2024, there's been $24 billion events as of November 1st. And I just heard yesterday that there was a big bomb cyclone that hit out in the Northwest. I'm sure there's, quite a bit of damage associated with that, to be determined how costly that was. And there were a couple other events in the news after November 1st that may have added to this as well. But $24 billion events as of 2024. And then when you look at just the last 3 years, there were 66 events. And then when you look at the last 5 years, there was 102. So again, it's just seeing that increase in frequency and intensity of these disasters. Here's just kind of a snapshot of 2024 in general. You can see across the country where these events occurred. So these are those $24 billion events. Obviously, we had Hurricane Milton and Debbie and Helene all come across the southeast there, but there's been other events that have happened as well that you've probably heard in the news. When we look at trees and climate change, the research has suggested that urban trees are going to be more vulnerable to these events as you would expect. So as I mentioned, pest, disease, thing I didn't mention, late spring frost damage, and then drought stress. So the interesting thing with the hardiness zones changing or shifting rather is that trees are going to have to be more resilient to not only hotter and drier conditions, but as you start to see species migration potentially north, whether assisted or natural, these trees also need to be adapted to those cooler temperatures because you're going to see a little bit both extremes. But research has started to just kind of scratch the surface of this assisted migration on some species that might be better for future climates. Some of that work's also being done in my lab right now with my PhD student Tegan, and then the other work that I'm familiar with is out in California. Not a lot of work's been done on it yet, but I assume we're going to see more of it moving forward. Just to kind of touch on some of the trees and climate change work that has been done. I mentioned the stuff out in California. They looked at 16 different cities and they evaluated 140 species. And the big takeaway was when they looked at the suitability of these species in these urban landscapes, about a little over half of them are no longer going to be suitable for planting by the end of the century. There was another study that looked at 30 years of street tree data on the East Coast. And basically what they saw was that about 73% of the species are going to be shifting westward over time. 63% are going to be moving towards the poles. And we're likely to see species that are no longer viable in these areas. And then you're also going to see species that might be faring better. So the climate and the conditions, might actually be more conducive to future growth and survivability for some species. And then just in general in the East, they're looking at annual temperature increases, the center part of the country, increased precipitation. And then the Southeast, we're going to experience more drought-like conditions. And then some other research that's been done. There's been some stuff related to species distribution and biology, changes in phenology. So, one thing is we might start seeing trees leaf out at different times, either, slightly earlier in the year, slightly later, same with flowering or transitions to fall color. These are all things that could be impacted by increases in temperature, additional precipitation, less precipitation. There's another study that looked at species in the Philadelphia area. So there were 73 species. And what they found was that, 10 of them are likely going to decline. The majority of them are probably going to, be fine. And then 2 of them are actually going to do better than what they're currently doing. So again, it's kind of species dependent. And we'll see how that plays out. And then there's been other studies that have evaluated the suitability of species for different climates based off of current conditions. And again, it kind of just varies across species is what they're finding. And then lastly, there was a couple other studies I was able to come across. Again, not a lot of work on the topic, but one study looked at about 3,000 tree and shrub species across 78 countries. And they found that about 56% of the trees and 65% of the shrubs are already basically stressed out. They're beyond their range of acceptable conditions. Um, so it's only going to get worse moving forward. And then another study interviewed public and private urban forestry practitioners and basically wanted to see if they, believed in climate change. And, the consensus was they did, but unfortunately they weren't doing anything to kind of plan or push the needle as far as future plantings. So rather than trying to get ahead of it, they were just, doing the same thing they always do. Which again, if we can be proactive with some of those plantings, maybe we will minimize the negative impacts of warming. So maybe we'll lose less canopy cover, and maybe some of those trees that we plant will actually thrive in those future conditions. And then lastly, there was a study that basically put together a large literature review synthesizing all of the research that's been done to basically come up with some potential nature-based solutions that could address climate change issues related to our urban forests. So, this isn't necessarily specific to Florida, but, here, as well as other coastal areas, we have this high concentration of urban developments along the coast. And this is going to be a mix of, planned landscapes, natural areas. So we'll have outcroppings of, forests and other things that are kind of retained for, either nature or, leisure, outdoor activities, stuff like that. And in these areas, these trees do experience extreme wind events pretty regularly and can potentially sustain some damage. We obviously saw that this fall with some of the hurricanes that impacted the Gulf. And then, even trees that are structurally sound can potentially fail. And I mention this because, proactive maintenance is the best thing we can do. I get calls when storms are coming in. Hey, the storm's going to be here in 2 days. What can I do to make sure my trees don't fail, or, that they, don't impact my house? And at that point, it's a little too late. You need to be proactive with your maintenance. It's not just a one-time event. You need to, throughout the life of the tree, every 3, 4 years, get some sort of tree work done, which can be a hard sell for some people. It's not cheap, but it's something that's going to protect your trees and your property long term, especially as we see an increase in these extreme wind events. So obviously, Florida, we're familiar with the hurricanes, but essentially, hurricane season goes from beginning of June to the end of November. Um, and the peak part of that season is going to be somewhere towards the middle part of August to the end of October. And since they've been tracking them, there's been about 500 hurricanes that have hit the state of Florida. And they've been tracking them since about 1850. We get hit with more hurricanes than any other place in the United States. All parts of the state have been impacted at one point or another. But it's worth pointing out, if you look at storms in the recent 10 years or so, it seems like a lot of the most damaging storms are coming up through the Gulf. And from what I've read and from what I've heard, it seems to be the result of the warmer temperatures in the Gulf as time goes on. So, it's likely we're going to see a lot more, strong storms come up through the Gulf rather than hitting on the Atlantic side like we've seen previously. And then when you look at the most costly hurricanes on record, 5 out of the most expensive hurricanes have happened since 2017. So that'd be, Harvey, Ian, Maria, Ida, Irma. Very expensive storms, with the exception of Katrina, which that was kind of a different beast because the city wasn't really designed to withstand that type of storm and flooding. Obviously with the levee situation, but just looking at extreme storms, category 4s, we've had 5 in the past 7 years that are 5 out of the top 7 most expensive. So just something to consider. Maybe this is a sign of things to come. In relation to the climate change piece. So, why do trees fail? This whole concept of likelihood of failure. Well, there's two factors that go into it. So there's these intrinsic factors. These are things that are specific to the tree, things like the size of the tree, are there structural defects? Certain species are more likely to fail than others when they experience some sort of loading. And then extrinsic factors, these are things that are exterior to the tree itself. So site conditions, maybe you got a large tree in a small planting space. Previous maintenance, maybe the tree was improperly pruned. So, let's say they lion's tailed it and removed all the interior branches. That tree is going to have forces applied to it in different spots than it normally would if the tree had those interior branches. So, could be more likely to fail as a result of that. But big thing is when a tree exceeds its load bearing capacity as a result of an extreme wind event or snow or ice loading, that's when it's more likely to fail. So we think a lot about hurricanes here in Florida. I'm not originally from Florida. I'm from Illinois, so I was more familiar with tornadoes, and I didn't really think about tornadoes much in the context of Florida. But we do have a lot of tornadoes pop up as a result of hurricanes moving through. And unlike hurricanes where, we might know a week, 10 days out that something's heading our way, we might not know exactly where it's going to hit until, a day or two out. But tornadoes, you might only have 13 minutes to prepare, sometimes even less than that. I remember siren going off when I lived back in Illinois, and you go to the basement, but just overall less predictable. And when you look at those billion-dollar weather events, just comparing tornadoes and hurricanes, so severe storms, those include tornadoes, and the tropical cyclones is going to be your hurricanes. On average, when you look across that 44-year period that we looked at earlier, per event, you're looking at $2.5 billion for a tornado, and a hurricane about 22 billion. And the average cost per year over that 44-year period is about 11 billion for tornadoes and about 32 billion for hurricanes. So specifically to tornadoes here. So when you're looking to frequency of where these things are actually occurring, the biggest part of the state that you would think would be Hurricane Alley or Tornado Alley, right up the center of the state. But then also Florida is actually third on the highest number of tornadoes annually with 66. I'm going to put this into context. The United States has more tornadoes than any other country in the world. We have about 1,200 a year, and the next closest is going to be Canada with 100. So not even close to the amount of tornadoes that we experience every year anywhere else. So when you're comparing tornadoes to hurricanes, so tornadoes are on the EF scale. So this is the enhanced Fujita scale. And they range anywhere from, low end 65 mile an hour up to over 200. And then the Saffir-Simpson scale, this is what we use for hurricanes, and that goes anywhere from 74 miles per hour up to over 157. I heard recently that they're possibly thinking about adding a category 6 just because we've been having such extreme hurricanes in recent years as far as wind speed goes. But if you compare the two tornadoes to hurricanes, the highest wind speed tornado on record was 302 mile an hour. I don't know about you guys, but I can't even imagine what that would be like. And then the highest hurricane on record was 190 mile an hour. So tornadoes can be a lot more extreme as far as wind speeds go. It's going to kind of shift gears here. Again, still, in the mindset of these extreme disasters. I was down in Texas shortly after they had the freeze in 21 doing a talk, and they asked if I'd put together some slides. And, I found it interesting as far as the severity of this freeze. I wasn't super familiar with other than, what I saw just briefly in the news. But when I looked into it, ended up being somewhere in the 80 to $130 billion range as far as the damages caused. And then there was about 210 deaths. But if you just look at the negative numbers on the screen right now, this is below on any one of those given days in that day period there what their average temperatures are. So they were getting, 20 below the normal in some situations for that time of year in the winter. So they were experiencing stuff that they weren't, prepared for, and a lot of the trees specifically just were not adapted to those conditions. So um, the interesting thing is I just checked about a week ago, and they still have not had any peer-reviewed research that has come out on the topic, which is interesting because they did have a lot of tree-related issues. Specifically, there was a lot of trees, oaks being one, that did not leaf out the following spring. So unfortunately, there was a lot of people that had that knee-jerk reaction, like, "Hey, my tree's dead," and they cut them down. But they were recommending at the time, wait until summer and see if the tree comes out. Try to keep the trees healthy if they do look stressed. So, limiting factor is always irrigation. So, but eventually, most of the trees did leaf out. Unfortunately, there were trees that were removed. There were trees that died, but just something that was very unexpected that they weren't prepared for. Just to kind of give you some general understandings of different species survival and stuff like that. There was some reports that came out at the time, again, not peer reviewed, but just kind of some anecdotal information that some people in the area were putting together. The Chinese tallows and ligustrums didn't really fare too well. Some of the elms were getting some frost cracks. Magnolias, they mainly had leaf damage. And then the oaks, for the most part, fared pretty well, with the exception of the red oaks had a little bit more damage. Somewhere near 25% of those were affected. And then some of the pines, didn't have needles on them, but then new growth came out the following year. But essentially, being more prepared and proactive for these events is going to save us time, money, and maximize those benefits moving forward. So, we do have some opportunities, as green industry professionals here to maybe, plan for these future events and save some of our canopy cover as a result. So it's about mitigating some of these negative effects and being more prepared. So, some things we can do here is, things related to designing sites better, selecting appropriate species, things we want to consider, how are these species going to grow in these conditions? What characteristics do they have? The benefits associated with those. How, do the members of the public feel about the species that we're planting in these areas? Because you want to get buy-in. Obviously, avoid any sort of invasive potential issues, liabilities, messiness, things like that. But ultimately, trees often grow poorly in urban areas unless we develop infrastructure around them that's specifically designed to accommodate future root growth. So obviously the image here, this isn't conducive to the long-term survival of that tree. But, other things within the urban landscape that can lead to higher mortality rates, poor soil quality, compacted soils, increased temperatures. So you'll hear urban heat island effect. This can result in drought-like conditions, so temperature, lack of moisture, any sort of development or construction that they don't protect the tree and make sure that enough of the root zone is safeguarded against any sort of construction activities. A lack of maintenance can also be problematic. So if trees aren't maintained proactively, defects can grow large. This can result in failures. Large pruning cuts might need to be made on trees over time to achieve vertical clearance. And then sometimes, as a result of all this, we end up removing trees prematurely and we don't realize those long-term benefits. Put it in context, there's been plenty of studies that have looked at survival of trees in the urban landscape. A lot of trees don't make it past 15 years as a result of these issues. And then other studies have found that we don't actually start seeing the long-term benefits of trees until after about 25 years. So it's basically costing us up until that point with all the inputs, maintenance, the cost of the tree itself, damage to infrastructure, all those things. So just something to keep in mind. Another reason why we need to design sites that are more conducive to long-term growth. So certain species are going to do well in these areas. Unfortunately, sometimes those get planted more heavily, so we need to avoid monocultures. Species diversity is always going to be better, especially when we have some of these issues related to climate change. But then also kind of problematic is sometimes there's species we want to plant, but we just can't get enough of them or in a size that makes sense for planting in the urban landscape. That's commonly the issue with a lot of native species. They're, small container size, things that could be easily damaged, and you can't get a lot of them in large enough quantities. So, big thing, right tree, right place. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. It's a means of saving time and money with our urban tree plantings. There's a lot of different resources out there that you can kind of lean on to determine what species are going to do well in your area. Online resources, literature, local knowledge, things like that. We just revamped a tree selector that the University of Florida had previously. Dr. Gilman had developed it back in the 90s, kind of went offline when Adobe Flash went away back in 2020. So we just recently brought that back, but that's another thing. You can go in and put in your site conditions and desired species characteristics, and it'll kick out a list of species that are conducive for that site. But essentially, low survival rates equal loss of long-term benefits. So it's all about matching that species to the site. And then also you want to start with high quality nursery stock. If you plant a tree that's riddled with defects and then on top of it, there's no proactive maintenance, odds are that tree is not going to fare too well over time. Lots of resources in regard to right tree, right place. Here's just an example of one from the Arbor Day Foundation, but it just basically gives guidance on what trees are going to do well in a general sense in certain site conditions. On top of that, obviously, we want to like the tree that we're planting in an area. So, things to consider are, its function in the landscape. Does it provide shade? Is it have some sort of drought tolerance for future conditions? Mature size is important. You want to make sure the tree grows within a space rather than outgrows the space. Maybe you want a fast growing tree. Maybe you want something with showy flowers or leaf color if you're up north. And then other things to consider, maybe wood strength, is the tree going to be more resilient in some sort of wind event? And then adaptability to urban landscapes, that could be really beneficial for future climate change. So, before you plant, you want to make sure you do some sort of site evaluation, certain above ground attributes. So you have environmental factors. These are going to be things like access to sunlight, exposure to wind, neighboring trees, and then your urban factors. So things like proximity to utility lines, buildings, signs, anything that the tree could, grow into. And then below ground site attributes, things related to the soil, quality, compaction, drainage. And then, are there any potential site modifications that can be made to improve the success and long-term survivability of the tree? So maybe you can move lights or wires, mend the soil, improve drainage. As far as soil amendments, so I will say if the tree does not grow well at the site as it is, it's probably not the right species for that site, because once the roots grow out beyond the amended soil, it's back in the native soil anyway. So it's pretty much a waste of time and money even amending it. So just make sure that the species fits the site in the first place. And then also consider any sort of maintenance after the fact. So, need for irrigation, pruning, fertilization, pest control. And again, similar to the soil amendments, fertilization, you're better off just matching the species to the site rather than trying to chase your tail fertilizing it. So I mentioned the tree selector site a little bit ago. This is the homepage, but essentially it helps with, questions related to site attributes, so soil, size of planting space, proximity to infrastructure, and then those tree characteristics, so mature size, fruit, flower, foliage. But essentially, it's going to generate a list of suitable species for hardiness zones 8 through 11, so all of Florida. And there's some other sites out there too, Morton Arboretum, Texas A&M, Arbor Day Foundation, but none of those sites kind of walk you through the same process as this site does. It has what we call the expert system, where essentially there's an arborist built into the program where it asks a whole bunch of questions and kind of walks you through as if they were there at your site to make sure that the species that is recommended is conducive to those site conditions. So these are all good examples of right tree, right place. So you got nice wide planting strips, far enough away from infrastructure. We want to see more situations like this. But unfortunately, we see a lot of situations like these where the infrastructure conflicts, elevated levels of risk due to trip hazards here. You're going to have a loss of long-term benefits as these trees start to decline, increased costs of maintenance, and it just looks like trash as well. So, that aesthetic piece is also just as important as the benefits that trees provide. So you want to make sure you match the mature tree size to the planting space, promote the health and success of the trees, and then reduce the likelihood of damage to infrastructure. So here's some more examples of small planting spaces. Trees going to become stressed. The growth is potentially going to be stunted, low survival rates. The big thing here is the image on the left, that small little planting island. You've been better off just paving the entire parking lot at that point. This is a waste of time and money. That tree's not going to survive. The tree in the center there, this is a little bit better design, where you have a peninsula with one end of it kind of open out into a larger soil strip out there. And then the image on the right is going to be your best option. The roots just have a lot more access to soil and they can grow, down this strip in either direction. It's going to lead to better growth and survival. So then when you're looking at the above ground issues, here's some situations where we have utility lines and, proximity to other structures and things like that. So, similar to the below ground conflicts, again, you want to look up as well. So we want to avoid trees growing into utility lines. For one, it just looks like trash, but it could lead to potential power outages, higher increased frequency of pruning, things like that. Ultimately, this is kind of what the tree would like to have as far as, optimal growth, survival, all that. The roots can, grow potentially 2 to 3 times as wide as the crown on a decurrent tree. Fine roots can go, well beyond the canopy at maturity. So, we want spaces that are larger like this. This is going to help support the tree during some sort of wind event. But unfortunately, what we see is more situations like this. So you have those utility lines above, small planting space down below. Tree has to be butchered essentially in order to keep it out of the utility lines, and this is not conducive for long-term growth and survival. So, one thing that is commonly ignored, I guess, would be this zone of rapid taper. So if you look at the image on the left there, this 3 4 inch caliper tree fits in that 4 or 5 foot planting strip when the tree's installed. But then over time, you get situations like you have here on the right where the tree outgrows the space. So we need to account for that future growth. There's been some work on the topic where they've looked at trunk flare diameter and DBH, and they basically have this proportional relationship. So as the DBH gets larger, so does the trunk flare diameter. So if you account for this, they did some work with some inventory data based off of trees at maturity to see how large of a planting strip you would need based off of the diameter of the tree and some species differences. So you account for this with a 4 foot buffer on each side plus the trunk flare diameter. And what Kozer found was that for a 69-inch live oak, you need about a 16-foot wide strip. 54-inch laurel oak, you need about a 14-foot strip. And for a 8-inch crepe myrtle, you need about a 3-foot strip. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not seeing a lot of planting spaces this wide for any of those species. Even on the low end, I see crepe myrtle sometimes planted in 18 inches. So, we can obviously do better than this. We know we need to do better, but unfortunately, space is always a hot commodity in the urban landscape. So, some potential solutions to accommodate tree roots in the urban areas, root barriers, alternative sub-base materials, channeling roots. The one thing, and we're going to look at some other, possible solutions here is the know-how is sometimes lacking as far as being able to do this. Not a lot of contractors actually, do installations like this, but then also the additional costs associated with it. It's a lot easier just to throw a tree in the ground, and if it dies, replace it, than it is to develop a site that is conducive for future growth. And unfortunately, it's kind of this habit we've gotten into. And I understand that budgets are constrained and all that, but either way, just something to consider when you have existing sidewalk issues, and you want to repair them and maybe replace it with something that's going to be better for the tree. You could shave the surface of the concrete. That might buy a couple extra years as the roots are lifting it. You could potentially remove the concrete entirely and bridge over it. Different surface materials like pavers. You can move the sidewalk around it. But the big thing here is no matter what you do, try not to damage the roots in the process, because that could lead to stability issues and stress for the tree. So, these are all great options. You got the pavers up in the top left. You got a sidewalk that was raised up and poured over in the top right. And then you can see the bottom left there, they put a ramp across the pieces of concrete. Again, just avoid damaging the roots. Other things you can do is design the space prior to the tree growing in the ground. So, structural soil cells, kind of what you see there on the left. You can do suspended sidewalks. This would be the image in the middle there at the bottom. There's a lot of good examples of that if you're down in Austin, Texas. Essentially, there's a foot, maybe 18 inches below the bottom surface of the concrete before you get down to the top of the soil surface. And as the trunk gets larger in diameter, they cut the concrete away from it over time. So you don't have any tripping issues. You don't, have any girdling issues on the lower trunk of the tree as a result of it growing into the concrete. So that might be another option. But again, just different ways of thinking about these designs in the urban landscape. Another thing to consider that is relevant to the hurricane piece is outside of just planting certain species that might be more wind resistant, the design aspect, rather than planting individual trees, if we plant trees that are mimicking kind of that natural design, so trees in a forested area, maybe this can dampen some of the effects of the wind, as well as these trees that have competition from their neighbors are less likely to develop large defects low in the canopy that could potentially fail. Whereas an open grown tree, you're going to develop large, low growing limbs, potential defects all over the canopy as a result of access to sunlight because they're not having competition with their neighboring trees. And there's just been some, anecdotal research that's been done over the years that have noticed that trees that are planted in groups survive wind events a little bit better than these trees that are open grown. So, the spacing piece, I kind of mentioned this here, but, just from a maintenance aspect as well, when you plant trees closer together, there's potentially less maintenance. My lab is working on a project in this vein where we're planting trees closer together based off of minimum planting distances for municipal codes to see if there's less maintenance associated with it and the formation of defects. So hopefully I'll be reporting on that down the road. I can share that information with you. Um, so, big takeaways here, careful planning and design, incorporating that right tree in the right place, promoting the future growth of the tree, making sure the trees stay healthy to a mature age. And then, making sure there's plenty of above and below ground space for the tree to grow into the future. It's going to help with anchorage and eliminate some of those infrastructure conflicts. And hopefully these trees will be better suited to withstand, extreme wind events, drought-like conditions, any sort of things that are associated with climate change. Um, you know, all that said, there's a lot of different groups that are involved with these decisions. So, municipal departments, practicing arborists, landscape architects, the utilities are involved, HOA. So just lots of different stakeholders that may have a say in the process. The big thing is, making sure that we adhere to these local codes and ordinances, making sure there's some sort of consistency as far as, designs, qualities of trees, stuff like that. And, we're going to be better off in the future. And then trying to incorporate, more creative design solutions that accommodate future root growth. So I mentioned quality of nursery stock slightly. In Florida, we have grades and standards for nursery plants. One thing I will say, it's a great document, but it's not enforced. It's a recommendation system. So, they have different grading for the quality of trees, and some municipal codes will say you got to have a Florida #1 or higher quality, fancy being the highest quality, and #1, #2, and then a cull. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing a lot of times is even though it'll say that in code, it's not always being enforced. A lot of the issues lie with, municipalities being understaffed, underfunded, things like that. But if we start with high quality nursery stock, the tree is going to be more likely to survive and less likely to have any future issues. That said, if you don't incorporate the proactive maintenance piece, you can plant the nicest tree in the world, and if the tree just sits in the ground for 10 years and no one does anything with it, it's going to have a lot of issues. So it's a twofold there. You got to start with high quality nursery stock, and you also have to be proactive with your maintenance. So, some of the advantages of, selecting high quality nursery stock, more likely to survive in the landscape. It's going to establish better, less likely to fail in storms. Again, if you're also pairing it with that proactive maintenance piece. So, some things to consider, what kind of production method are we looking at? The size of the tree, are there any defects? Specifically, root defects are going to be the ones that could affect establishment and then stability in the soil. And then any sort of above ground defects, are they, minimal to where they can be mitigated at planting, or is it something where the tree should be getting rejected? That's the big thing. I don't see enough of these trees being rejected. And then, after you have that high quality tree, making sure that you follow proper planting procedures, because you could start with the greatest tree in the world, but let's say, for example, you plant it too deeply or you leave on synthetic materials. These are all things that can impact establishment and long-term survivability. So there's plenty of documents out there. The last slide was the BMPs for tree planting, which is a good guiding document. Here's essentially the gist of all those things. So, evaluating the site, making sure you're digging the hole appropriately, eliminating any sort of defects. Again, start with high quality and you're going to be better off. Making sure that that topmost root is going to be above grade, because nursery stock is going to settle over time until it establishes. Stabilizing the tree, removing those synthetic materials that could potentially girdle the trunk. Backfilling, adding a slight layer of mulch, not too much, because this could also lead to some root issues down the road, and then any sort of staking or protection materials if needed. Again, if the tree is not high quality or needs a little bit of, maintenance, structural pruning goes a long way. It's about identifying and maintaining a dominant leader that's free of defects. So lots of factors that play into, whether or not trees are successful in the urban landscape. There's lots of things we can do from a management perspective, planning, design, all that. Again, high quality trees, proactive maintenance, right tree, right place are all going to set us up for success. I only got about 3 minutes here. I'm just going to go through these slides real quickly, but essentially this is some of the work that my lab's doing in related to climate change. So we're doing some work out in California where there's been some recent fires. So the Tubbs Fire, Thomas Fire, and the Camp Fire. We have research plots in cities that were all impacted where we're going and basically, following up with tree inventory data to see the damage and the survival and associated risk of the trees that are still in these fire impacted areas. Here's just an example of one of the cities and the trees that we're looking at. Here's some pretty common damage, stem scorch, anywhere from 20 to 50%. You can see what that looks like. But these are trees that were retained. Big takeaway is, were there trees that were removed that maybe could have been saved? So that's kind of what we're trying to get at with some, recommendations for future management from planting, design, all that stuff. Also involved with Climate Smart Landscape Project, which is an extension project that we're trying to work with green industry professionals to maybe move the needle forward on some of their business practices. Along with that, there was a needs assessment and a whole bunch of survey questions. Big takeaway was, a lot of the green industry professionals believe in climate change and see that it's impacting their business, and they're open to, maybe trying some different things to push the needle forward as far as, green practices within their particular business. Hopefully we're going to have an EDIS article out on this shortly, and then also a Journal of Extension publication sometime next year. I mentioned quality in nursery stock quite a bit. We have a study going on right now that looks at quality nursery stock in Florida for a common species, live oak, common size, 15-gallon. Most people can fit that in their vehicle. And we did a random selection of all the growers in Florida that sell 15-gallon live oaks. And we planted out trees from 7 growers in the 2 box stores, and we evaluated the quality of the trees, and we're going to do some pruning on them, and we evaluate them annually based off of grades and standards to see differences. But you can see here, the trees ranged anywhere from about 14 foot tall down to about 4.5 foot, anywhere from an inch caliper up to about almost 3 inches, which is all over the place. Grades and standards kind of fall in the 6 to 7 foot range at about 1.5 inches. So you can see that some of the trees were undersized and some were oversized. We're looking at how roots potentially slip during extreme wind into wind events based off of soil saturation and wind speeds, and we're going to use some wind tunnels and 3D printed trees if we can get that funded. We're looking at likelihood of failure based off of improper pruning, so topping trees similar to trees under utility lines, and then also restoration pruning processes after the trees have been improperly pruned. And then just other studies looking at biochar and compost, development of defects based off of tree spacing, like I mentioned, size of planting space, how that can impact tree stability. And then we're always trying to collaborate with municipalities based off of inventory data following some sort of storm event. So that is all I have for you. Thank you for listening. If you got any quick questions, be happy to answer. Otherwise, I'm always open to receiving emails.
Hey, Ryan, you've got quite a few in the chat here. So let me see if I can dig up. Yeah, I linked in where I could, like the tree selector site. There's some questions about that. Let's see here. I think from John Harris, are you recommending trees be chosen using the storm resilience research results as well as the right tree, right place related to overhead and underground utilities? These are priority issues for Florida and really anywhere.
Yeah, so to that point, best way I can sum it up is we know a little about a little. So there's been some work on species failure profiles. There was some more anecdotal stuff back in the 2004 to 7 range based off of some prior storms. There's been some more recent work that Dr. Kozer came out with as part of the FEMA document. I've worked on some stuff as well. The one issue we have is we know, some information about certain species in certain wind speeds and soil saturations, but we don't know enough across a wider range of wind speeds and soil saturation. And then there's some species we don't know anything about. So, we do have some failure profiles, but I think it could become more robust over time as long as we have information from cities on the front end and then the back end. So what I mean by that is if we have a tree inventory that has some sort of condition ratings, size, species, all that stuff, then we have a storm hit, then we can, make some meaningful sense of that information rather than if just the storm hits and we go out and saw that those trees failed, we might not know exactly why they failed. I mean, we can guess, but it's always good having that front end data. So we just need a lot more information about a lot more species across a lot more wind speeds, and then I think we can, have a more robust data set. We're working towards it, but it's going to take time. So to your point, yes, you could use that information. It's going to get better over time. It's still better than nothing.
We got one question here. Can you recommend some street tree lists for South Florida? Are there any with an emphasis on natives?
So again, I would refer you to the FEMA document that Dr. Kozer came out with. I think it came out a year or two ago. Essentially, it synthesizes all the previous work that's been done on the topic of species failure profiles. And then they also went in and they modeled other species that were not included in the previous research on the topic. And so I want to say there's maybe 300 or 400 species that are included in that database. And I think you can download an Excel file as well as the PDF for the FEMA document. But that does include, species that would range the entire state. There's going to be natives in there as well as, ornamentals and stuff like that.
So we got any more questions here? Oh, how and where to get the FEMA document?
I can send it to John, and then if you want to reach out to John, he can. I have a hard copy of it. I don't remember exactly where I got it from, if it was sent to me or if there's a link somewhere, but I have a hard copy of it I could send to John.
Yeah. No, and I saw that that the document related to like trees and storms that Kozer and some of the associates that he works with kind of updated the one that we've been using for like the past 20 years. So that's kind of interesting too. That might be something I include, like to send out to folks as well.
Are you talking the IFAS hurricanes and tree program thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's that, but like there's the some of the edises that are out there specific to like the
Yeah, so that's the same thing then. So
yeah,
the
it's related to
hurricane
that.
program, like main document, includes 16 or 17 chapters, but then there's standalone edises. That should be completely updated sometime early next year. I was helping with that project as well. We're also going to have a website that's going to be kind of a hub of all things trees and hurricanes. It's going to include that program document, which is like 16, 17 chapters. It's going to have links to other documents. We'll have that FEMA document on there as well, I assume, and just anything and everything related to trees and hurricanes be kind of hopefully the hub for that. But early 25, we're finishing that up right now.
Is this the link right here? Someone put it in the chat.
The link to the FEMA document or the link?
Yeah, to the specifically to the FEMA document.
Yeah, it'll say Kozer and Salisbury.
Yep, I think that's it.
There's supposedly an Excel file you can download somewhere. I haven't had a chance to look into it. There might be a link on that PDF, but there's an Excel file you can download with all the species in them.
Cool. Are there any other questions out there in the audience. I mean, if you want to unmute yourselves or throw it in the chat, either way. And if not, you can always reach us later via email as well.
Yeah,
So,
I'm always happy to take questions, so don't be bashful.
yeah, there was pretty lively chat like in the chat too, but it wasn't so much like really like all of it being oriented towards questions afterwards here. So, oh yeah, so here's how do we prep the tree that was going in between the sidewalk and the street?
Prep it. What do you mean by that?
I don't know. It's a very open-ended. So how would you go about prepping? I think the question is like, I mean, in South Florida we end up calling them swales, but I mean the right-of-way area. Like, is there anything that you can do like for particularly like when there's not enough area for the rooting that it lines up with like what the recommendations from uh Devin Kozer's study.
Yeah, I
Um
mean, essentially, if the tree that you're trying to plant there is going to be too large for the space at maturity, then you need to plant something smaller. If you're worried about infrastructure conflicts, no matter what the size of the space, you could put root barrier in up along the curb and the sidewalk. That'll deflect the roots. But again, if you're putting too large of a tree in there, you're essentially planting a large tree in a small container. Um, the other thing is, if you do have these small spaces and there's money in the budget, you could put in soil cells underneath the infrastructure. This is going to increase the rooting space. You'd never know they were there. It still might look like a small planting strip, but you've increased the soil volume underneath the infrastructure. Again, the know-how and the added expense of that sometimes is a deterrent for municipalities based off of staffing and budgetary constraints, but that is another option.
okay, got one here. Okay. Yeah, someone put in here using tree growth regulators might also mitigate buttress root expansion by reducing canopy expansion. So,
Yeah, I mean, I see that used more with mature trees to kind of slow down the growth. I would say if you're planning on that from the onset, then you're still probably not planting the right species there. I know everybody wants to increase canopy cover, but I think we're underplanting understory trees. We're trying to fit square pegs into round holes a lot of times with some of our plantings, and I think that sets us up for some of these future issues. So if we can just get away with, or get away from that, we're probably better off. Also, the perception piece, because then people get negative perceptions of trees when you have these large trees planted in small spaces. Trip hazards, cracked sidewalks, stuff like that. So from a PR side, and how people view trees, there's some negative aspects as well there.
yeah, no, I got another one here. Are there particular trees that are likely to not do well in future hot temps in South Florida, like more northern species like magnolia, for example?
So I mean, the answer is yes. I don't think we know enough yet. Like I mentioned earlier, my lab's doing some studies with assisted migration. There's some stuff out in California. Um, there's not a lot of work that's been done on it, so I'm confident there's species that are not going to fare well moving forward. Anecdotally, I've been noticing just since I've been in the state, dogwood up in North Florida does not work well anymore. Redbuds are starting to look a little bit rough when we go through extended periods of drought. Sycamores, the further south you get, aren't always looking the greatest. I noticed when we had a drought up in Gainesville this past spring, we didn't have rain for about 4 months, and southern red oaks in my neighborhood actually had some wilted leaves. So I think we're on the beginning edges of seeing some of these species that maybe aren't going to fare well moving forward, assuming things continue to trend in the direction they are. So
Yeah.
just we don't have enough research out there to say definitively that, hey, the species isn't going to work well here moving forward.
So with that, I'm going to put a plug in for next month's webinar, which is actually me, and Yvette Gooddeal from Martin County. And we're going to be covering native tree species for South Florida. And we're going to cover a lot of them that are what we would have traditionally thought of as more species that are like in the Keys. That there would have been still cold temperatures going all the way down to Miami-Dade. Like they could kill off a lot of the ones that we had been using in our area, but those cold temperatures are kind of dropping out, like all along, especially along the coast. So that should be kind of an interesting topic, I think, if tree selection and tree species are something that you're interested in. And then from there, I think like to build on like what Ryan's saying, I'm not sure like how well it's understood, like all these species respond to drought and stuff like that and other aspects of it, because a lot of them are Caribbean species and they're still getting pretty good amount of water. But I don't know. It's one of those things that like, moving forward, we're probably still gonna have to build on like those species and just pick out the best ones that are gonna survive from there. It would be my guess. So I think with that, I don't think there's too much else floating around. Like I said, if you've got questions, please contact us. And maybe we'll do some live in-person stuff here with Ryan and some of the other UF folks that work with like urban forestry, arboriculture in the future for South Florida. I know that like they do a lot already with ISA partnering up with us, but maybe we can do something more specific too. Like with university research and that type of thing. So, but thank you, Ryan. Really appreciate you being here on this
Yeah, thanks for
fair
having me.
November day.
All right. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the holidays.
Take care, everybody.